This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Podcast episode 279 on this special Tuesday episode. I've got a bit of a twist from our normal programming. A few weeks ago, Tomme Arthur of Lost Abbey announced that they would, in his words, grow down. It's no surprise to brewers across the country and around the world who are facing this, current economic climate of rapidly increasing ingredient logistics costs, soft sales through the vital summer months, rising rents, and more. All these things are compounding into significant and challenging headwinds for brewers. Poor Lost Abbey, like many brewers of their generation, planned for growth, took on adjacent space when it became available. But growth for many brewers, whether they're craft or macro for that matter, has been hard to find over the past couple of years as the post-pandemic bounce that we were all hoping for never really materialized. I reached out to talk to Tomme about some of these issues facing the brewery, how they're handling them, for a Q&A in our latest issue of the industry-focused Brewing Industry Guide magazine. That issue is out now. Our office copies arrived last week. They're arriving to subscribers right now, and so I figured this is a great time to bring this conversation out. So here we are. Here we've got the audio from that conversation. I'm going to share that with you in a second. But first, AccuBrew is an analytical tool designed to collect and compare the information brewers need to produce consistent results and continuously improve the process of fermentation. AccuBrew is more than a progress bar and early warning system. It's an ever-evolving piece of technology tailored to you and your process. Save time and turn tanks faster, monitor and compare batch progress in real time, enter notes, set customer reminders and temperature alerts, and detect process issues before a batch is ruined. Quality, consistency, and confidence, that's what AccuBrew delivers. Visit accubrew.io today for a no-obligation 90-day trial. This episode's also sponsored by BSG, distributors of TNS hop oils, a revolutionary hop product that gives your beer all the hop intensity with none of the astringency. Make better beer, get more from each turn with less work. Change your brewing game with TNS hop oils. Visit bsgcraftbrewing.com to learn more. And balancing barley and hops is your expertise. Food-grade lubricants is theirs. Clarion food-grade lubricants meet stringent standards of purity and performance for food and beverage processing, food packaging, cosmetic, and pharmaceutical applications. All Clarion lubricants are backed by the Clarion warranty, and they work with you to create an efficient lubrication program that helps protect your operation. To learn more, visit clarionlubricants.com/foodgrade. Clarion Lubricants, the expert that experts trust. And now my conversation with Tomme Arthur of Port and Lost Abbey. Maybe we should start with the first question. You recently announced that Lost Abbey Port hop concept are growing down. What do you mean by growing down? And what is that? How do you define growing down?
So I really wanted to kind of give a reference point to what we were trying to accomplish. And I thought that, there's a lot of people that come out and say they're right sizing, they're corrective actions, they're doing things, they're downsizing. But growing down for us was an approach that basically was, we understand that there could be growth in the future, but we need to get smaller today. And we need to be comfortable being smaller for an infinite amount of time. So being down or being under where we are needs to be our mantra. And then if growth comes to us because we find the right spark or the pieces that the connective tissues that we need, then we can grow through that. So the growing part's important. You're growing down or you're going down, but you're still maintaining a focus on what does it mean to grow in the future and how can we go about that. But getting to the right size, getting to the baseline and then working backwards from that, to try to find growth in the future.
It's definitely a different way of defining it. It's not a giving up. It's a understanding that the scale of the business in the current environment needs to be different to be competitive, to be profitable, and to be sustainable.
Yeah, I thought about this a lot. There's a lot of different ways to talk about retreating, retrenching, and those words they're very associative. And so I wanted to kind of frame it uniquely to, what I see as being something that a lot of people in the industry have had to go through or will be going through. But I wanted to kind of coin something that we could latch onto as a company and be like, we're doing this for us, but at the same time, we're not using just a standardized naming convention for something that a lot of people will be doing, which is essentially just getting smaller, but there's a reason for what we're doing.
What are some of the broader market dynamics that have driven this most recent move? Clearly, we went through a pandemic. People were seemingly buying lots of beer out in grocery stores. That trend has not continued in that, and we expected a rebound in the industry. At the same time, there's a lot of competition. You all built a brewery with certain kinds of goals in mind in a different environment, 8-10 years ago. And, what are some of the things you're looking at now that are driving some of the decision-making behind this?
So I think the biggest one is that we kind of have to start with the history. This company is going to be 17 years old when we get into the new year. So that sort of gives some context as to where we came from, where we grew up from, and kind of where we're at in our history. A 17-year-old brewery is old by many standards at this point, even though it's really not as a business. But when we started, there was growth. Growth was everywhere, right? When we opened our doors in 2006, if you were making good beer, good liquid, you could find growth very easily, whether it was through territorial expansion, even backyard. You could get to 10,000 barrels quickly, and I think we reached double-digit barrels in probably our fifth or sixth year on what amounted to be a pretty slow growth pattern for us. So we constantly approached every year like many breweries and businesses where growing was the success. That we're up 30%, 10%, 14%, whatever it is in our world. Growth is what you were benchmarking your success against. We made a lot of decisions in those last 10 years to invest in the company. And by investing in the company, we didn't take dividends. We put all the money in stainless steel. We own every tank in the building. Everything essentially is paid for, but now it's worth, pennies on the dollar. So was that the right strategy? Should we have invested all of that, or should we have gone to more, less of a lifestyle, where we were quality of life and we didn't have 3 shifts? Would it made more sense to be, operationally, much leaner with regards to all of our assets, but using them at a much higher rate? We've learned a lot over the years, and I think that what it really comes down to is that there isn't one singular way to run a brewery, and especially one with some of the complexities that we have with the different brands and a hugely sour, non-sour operation with the Abbey beers and the wood program and things like that.
I remember last time I was out there, you had this beautiful bottling line that you'd invested a huge amount of money in, and then a small canning line next to it that was now taking over the lion's share of the production. And that was just another example of the kinds of investments you'd made in quality that now the market isn't that interested in, despite your ability to produce at that kind of quality. How much of this do you think is driven by this rapid change we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years in consumer behavior? Everything from this excitement and then seeming like additional competition and now lower volumes within, sour and acid forward beer, combined with, differing strange trends within the IPA world, all these other pieces, the way that people want it in packaging, how much is driven by, the difficulty in having the right equipment and the right focus, to meet where the market continues to shift, while at the same time, you have to be cognizant of where the market may now be in 5 years from now, which could very well be different than where it is now.
Yeah, I'll tell you this, and this hasn't been put out to the ether yet, but in 2 weeks' time, there will be a crew coming to start disassembling the bottling line because we put it up for sale and we sold it to a brewery in Florida because we don't run it. I think it runs once a month right now. Our last payment on that bottling line will be due in January, so it will be paid off by the time basically that it ships out of here. So it's crazy to think that we just spent, over 5 years paying for an asset, brand new. It's a Maserati. It's a beautiful machine. It just takes up a lot of room. It doesn't run as frequently as it should, or otherwise, and it's going to find a new home because, as you mentioned, the canning line runs 3 days a week, maybe 4, and it spits out a lot more beer. And it's time for the canning line to be front and center. But that bottling line exists because we had a lot of square footage. It's a packaging hall. It takes a pretty good amount of space to have it's a 20 valve machine. And it takes a lot of space. And so by getting rid of the bottling line, that was the very first step in this process that we're on, was to get out from under having excess square footage that we were paying for that wasn't generating revenue. And that's a big part of our growing down strategy, is to shed the excess square footage that's very, very expensive in California.
Sure. How much does the product mix weigh into this? Certainly what people are interested in. We've even watched certain styles in the last 5 years peak and then, maybe even potentially start to either stay static or decline. Things like hazy IPA, which were once growing so quickly, things like, kettle quick sours, even things like pastry stouts, all seem to have popped up and now, maybe not showing the same kind of growth numbers that they once did. Hard seltzer, came out of nowhere, grew really fast, and now seems to be on a plateau or decline. How much does this kind of rapidly changing consumer behavior and interest, impact how you operate the business?
It's a great question, because it's a pretty diverse model. So if I go back, and I think this is a great way to approach this. So, we will be, when we turn into the new year, we bought the bottling line in November of 2015. So we've had it for 7 years now. And 7 years ago, when we launched that machine, we basically brought Hop Concept online. So we had this hop forward brand, 22-ounce bottles only. There were no cans of it, draft beer, things like that. But in 7 years' time, that format has gone from 22-ounce to can. And in reality, it shifted to can 4 years ago. So we really only got 3 years of that brand under that platform of glass bottles. So shifted dynamically very, very quickly. But the consumerism is interesting, because the consumer doesn't seem to have a lot of love or need for glass containers at this point. You want acid beer, you can get quick sours, you can get other sours in cans. You want pastry stouts, I'll buy that in a can. The glass bottle doesn't seem to really resonate as a vessel anymore at a consumer level. It doesn't matter what kind of beer necessarily. It doesn't even take into account seltzers and kombuchas and all that. It's just on a beer level. There really isn't much that is in glass, and it's become very interesting. You start to think about people wanting to cellar beers and stuff, and our cellared cans of pastry stout 10 years from now, is that going to be an acceptable thing or not? And I truly don't know. Where the market's going, I don't. But right now, aluminum is king. We know that much.
When we look at the broader picture, there are so many financial challenges facing breweries today. Rising logistics costs that makes distribution much more expensive, which even makes things like wide and shallow distribution harder to be to make financially work. There was a time in the 2000s and early 2010s where you could find distributors that might want to sell a niche product like sour beer in small, shallow ways across major metropolitan markets, and might take and be able to distribute that. Certainly now with the cost of shipping across country, you need to be doing volumes, and you need to be very cost effective about the way that distribution happens to even make it work. How does that figure into what you all do, especially potentially on the Lost Abbey side?
Yeah. So you asked about distribution, and I guess one of the more interesting things, and this is kind of, shifts the gears to what's unique about our situation, or what makes this, what has made the big challenges for us. So I can explain to you that in many, many ways, it boils down to a couple of things. One, on a distribution level, we used to ship beer at a much higher volume to the East Coast, and we would have half truckloads and consolidated truckloads going to our distributors, and that doesn't exist anymore in our footprint. Most of our stuff heading to the East Coast is anywhere from 4 to 6 pallet positions, and so now we're on an LTL level, less than truckload, and that's expensive, and it's not as easy to make dollars and cents out of that. So that's number one. Number two, we've seen a much different distributor consolidation sort of footprint. And even within the same distributor footprint, the way that they approached brands, brought brands in, kind of pushed brands to the bottom. There's not much love for selling hand to table kinds of stuff right now. you want to have the trucks go in and drop stacks of things, and walking in with a case of Belgian beer is not an ideal situation. So even the specialty beer teams that used to exist at the distributor level have been consolidated or kind of dropped out. So that's been a part of it. A secondary concern for us has been that even in certain cities where we used to have very craft house focused kinds of partners, those distributors were sold to larger entities, and then at that point, some of the broader market conditions kicked in. More units, less stops, et cetera. So that's been problematic. And then specifically to our one of our largest challenges here in the past few years, and this is something that kind of flies under a lot of radars, is that we're on a commercial lease, and triple net leases are very landlord favorable and very not favorable to the tenant. So we're responsible for a lot of the upkeep. Well, within the last 6 years, this building flipped. It was sold. And when it was sold, it hadn't been sold for many, many years. And then they readjusted our property taxes. And so now we're on the hook for more building than we had 5 years ago at a higher tax rate at a time when things are declining. So that's been part of our internal, sort of look at it is, yeah, it made sense to be at a 40,000 square foot clip, but we can't afford 40,000 square feet anymore. So that's where, these things are kind of, they're so behind the scenes, and they don't really show up until they show up. And then all of a sudden when they do, they're pretty massive.
How much has some of the rising raw materials costs impacted you all?
I mean, it's so crazy because I said this the other day to some people, and I think it's true, with the exception of basically hops that we've been contracted for over a broader period. They're basically the only thing that really hasn't risen out of scale. So we might have a 10-cent increase year over year on a varietal, but that's predictable and it hasn't changed. Our barley prices, our two-row silo malt went up 60% last year. We've seen multiple hits on the cardboard corrugated level. We just got a letter in the mail 6 weeks ago that cost of CO2 was going up 20%. And then you take into account labor shortages, labor retention. There hasn't been a single place in our building, ostensibly outside of our hop contract, that really hasn't gone past a very defendable level of inflationary pressure, or whatever you want to call it, and it's absorbable. And I think that's kind of what we've really learned over the last 6, 8, 10 months, is that the amount of things that we're being asked to absorb is impossible. And I think that that's where this whole premise comes from, is that you get out of bed every day and you think you can find ways to absorb them, and then at some point they're untenable. And that's kind of where we're living.
Have you done any modeling of trying to solve the problem from the revenue side? In terms of price increases or finding ways to offset some of all of these other increasing costs?
So I used to talk to my financial director a lot about this, and there was always this sense that we always said, sales will fix everything, right? And that used to be a thing. If you had the right mix and you had the right margin and you grew sales, then you would have inevitably more profit available or more dollars available to you to dispense of them as need be. The problem is that sales are expensive. And if you aren't paying attention to what you're selling, or you're selling the wrong marginalized thing, then you don't have money available to you because it's the cost of the sale. The product itself isn't going to generate any revenue. So we've gotten away from a top line, growing sales will fix everything, to a much more inline sense of tops and bottoms. And the bottom is more important than ever, because there isn't any money without really, really paying attention to the bottom line inputs or where it's going out. So for us, it's not that we were flush over the years. It's just that now where are you going to allocate the wins, and then the losses are bigger than they've ever been.
I think you're right there, that this rising tide raises all ships, or this idea that growth alone can paper over some fundamental financial problems within the business itself, has been something that's allowed a lot of breweries to get away with things that are harder to get away with now. What are some of those, and I should say, when we're looking at this overall equation, people are a big part of this. Human beings working in a brewery are expensive. they're also facing the same kind of inflationary challenges within their own lives and their own family budgets that everyone else is. We understand that it's very realistic for them to want to find this kind of compensation. How do you then focus on the things that can allow for like efficiency, whether that's within the product mix, whether that's looking at automation, ways to make sure that to find ways to lower the expense of that while also not burning out staff and creating an environment that people don't want to work in?
That's a huge, heavy question. So let's start and let's dissect it in a couple of ways. The first thing is that employee capital is incredibly important, and it's not something that we have infinite level of spend on. So we can't just burn people out for the sake of continuing on a business. You have to be invested in their wellness, and that's a very difficult thing to do, especially coming out of a pandemic in the ways that we have. I mean, there's been a lot of people who have survived something that we never, and I don't mean survived from I didn't get sick. I mean survived from a very level of my wellness, right? So as we're talking, it's really important for the listeners to understand that we are in California. We are currently paying almost $5.50 a gallon for gas, which turns to grocery prices, which minimum wage minimum wage at the state level is now $15 an hour. In the new year, it flips to $15.50. This is a very interesting story. We didn't realize it was supposed to cap at 15 last year, but there was a trigger in the system for if inflation went above a certain percentage, and it went above that certain percentage this year. So now the last minimum wage increase that we thought we were going to see should have been January 1 of this year, but because there's a new inflation mechanism, now it's another 50 cents when we get to 23. That wasn't even in the budget for at some point in 22, right? We all looked at each other and said, great, we've survived the minimum wages at this point. Now we can understand what that looks like. But every time that happens, the entire hospitality team, any of the minimum wage pieces go up, and that translates into more and more. So we have crazy California pricing. We have crazy California rules. We love making beer in the Golden State. It's an amazing place to make and sell beer for so many reasons, and we don't want to get away from that. But it's a very different reality than a brewery in a state in the middle of the country or otherwise. So it's something that we have to at least explain as part of our DNA and our daily business, that they don't look the same. And of course, rents in California are off the charts, and most places commercial rents and even personal rents are way up. But all of that looks very different. To answer your question, every single thing that we kind of have to pay on has been problematic. But there was a point last year in the fall, sometime around August, where the entire operation here had to get paid more because it started to kick in that it just wasn't enough. And my financial director said to me, how are we going to afford to pay these people more money than we're currently paying? And I said, if we don't pay them, we won't have anything to sell. And that's like business 101, right? If you don't pay them more, will you be able to make more, or not even more, make the product you need, like horse, cart, tail, et cetera. It's a crazy situation, but ultimately, if you don't have people, you can't make product.
How then do you think about what you make and how you make it in order to optimize around that? Are you all pulling more process and work or person intensive beers and product approaches out of the mix? Are you rebalancing so that while you continue some of those more hands-on things, they're just happening at a smaller level at a higher price point? How do you adjust for that in order to again try to not to just extract the most labor out of people, but also make sure that they are producing in the most efficient kind of way so that you can afford this new reality that you're facing?
Yeah, I think we saw a lot of that and kind of some of the burnout. I mean, we lost 5 employees, and we're a team of 15 at some point, and I think we lost 5 of them last summer. Some left for other positions in the part of the Great Resignation, and people left on their own terms and things like that. I don't believe that we overworked people to the point where that was it, but it was maybe a function of not compensating at a level that they had opportunities to go change and adjust for. For us, I'm most worried about our sour beer program more than anything else in terms of what we make, because the cost to justify the space isn't that simple anymore. And we used to sell a significant portion of our beer was aged and sour, and those were at a higher price point, higher margin, and that all translated into more opportunity, more building space, more free cash, everything you need to run a business. And that almost is kind of like water in the West these days. It's kind of lakes are drying up, and that's a reservoir. And we're starting to see a lot of breweries who heavily invested in sour beer, mixed culture sour beer fermentation, not quick kettle stuff. Really having to reevaluate, how much landscape and position you're willing to commit to something that doesn't have a really high level of consumerism. There aren't people banging on our door saying, "When's your next sour beer release coming out?"
And that's a challenge. Obviously there are some expenses with sour beer that, like you're not paying for yeast amongst other things, generally speaking. But, at the same time, the real estate where you are, the ability to stack barrels a certain amount of height because you have to be aware of earthquake, danger. There's all sorts of other challenges that come around that. What do you, expect to see then over the next 3 or 4 years, in terms of product mix? Is that going to be a shift to some of those beers with shorter production times that you can find more profit in, especially on that hoppy side? Is that, which also, could potentially meet what consumers want from you? How do you then start to think about what this brewery and its mix means to the customers that you have and the customers that you want to find you?
I think the biggest challenge that we're under right now is that, we're about an 8,000 barrel a year brewery. And we're known, most of the volume of beer that leaves this building is in a very hoppy land. So the Port Brewing Mongo is our best selling beer. It's 30+% of our total sales. And we have the Hop Concept brands, which are all IPA forward focused, et cetera. Lost Abbey as a brewery brand is only about 15 to 1,800 barrels of beer a year. That's a really small operation by many, many standards. So for us, how can we be an 8,000 barrel a year brewery with a sour and a non-sour component? And just one of the challenges that kind of comes into play is that you mentioned earlier that we had a glass bottling line, we had a small canning line, we have a glass sour bottling line, we have a sour canning line. So even under my one roof line, I've got 4 different packaging lines in order to do some of the product mix that we do. Seemingly, if we sharpened our knives a little bit differently, we might look at it and say that's too much at that size. Maybe at 30,000 barrels, it makes much more sense. But at 8,000 barrels, it's probably too much. But that's our current reality. And maybe next year, I'd come back on this and we're having a conversation and we're at 4,000 barrels and we're way differently positioned against, what is possible. And to be very clear, what does the market want from Port Brewing? What does it want from Hop Concept? And what does it want from Lost Abbey? And that remains to be seen. But I can tell you that the Lost Abbey brand will continue to want to be experimental Belgian sour, things like that. And even at 1,500, 1,800 barrels, we think there's plenty of room for us to do that and not need a super wide and shallow footprint.
Sure. Even what many folks would consider to be the top of the top in that sour and wild beer world of Cantillon is still only 2,500 barrels a year. And so if that's the production of the best, I think it's a safe assumption to make that, 1,500 to 1,800 barrels is actually quite extensive. It's quite a significant amount of production for that style of beer in Southern California, especially given how many producers are making it. Not that everyone's making it at the quality that Lost Abbey is.
And that's really important for us. We've wanted to be a world-class brewery, and that's been on the whiteboard since day one. Was we want we want the Lost Abbey brand to be recognized for being world class, even though, aspirationally we want to make sour beers and wood aged beers and unique things. And some of them don't have some of what we do, clearly has had peers over the years, but at the same time, we just want to be us. And we can do that if we keep true to what we have, what we aspired to be. But it's getting to be more difficult when you start having conversations about where you're going to find those sales. Not because there's been a lack of consumers, there's just more people making them, and therefore the slice of the pie is much smaller.
You currently have a 30-barrel brew house, which was one that you all purchased that was the original Stone production brewery. What's your next production step? What do you intend to replace that with in order to maintain your 8,000 barrel-ish production or whatever this next goal is as you grow down? How do you see it from a production standpoint? And how are you going to, again, adjust around that in order to make sure that you can produce the amount of beer you need to do on a smaller system? What's that system size going to be? Yeah. And how are you envisioning that?
So when the article broke on November 1st, we came out and stated that the brewery assets were available for sale because we wanted to see if there was a way to kind of horse trade. And that would be like, hey, we want to walk away from this 30-barrel brewery that was built to do 25,000 barrels and can do 25,000 barrels, but we don't need that level of capacity. When we were growing up all those years from 2006 till now, every single time that we bought a new fermenter and bolted it to the floor, it was at a minimum of 3-batch tanks. So nothing less than 90 barrels was installed in the brewery. So we went from a 30-barrel production kit, which is fine. The 30-barrel system is not the problem. It's that the tanks in the building are nothing less than 30 times 3 times 4 times 5 times 6. And what that causes now is problems with just pure volume. We are not brewing many 150 barrel batches of beer. So every time I need to clean that tank, every time I need to purge that tank, CO2, drain it, redo it, I'm spending a lot of extra money in things that we're calling soft costs, stuff that doesn't really show up. Our chemical costs are higher, our CO2 usage is higher. The chillers on the roof are, more expensive because they have to run, they're larger and they run more. So we're going to continue to operate now. We've spent the last almost a month kind of having, kind of kicking the tires on the 30. The 30 is not the problem. It is the larger tanks. So we're going to turn our attention to being much smaller at a footprint level. We're probably going to put a couple of the larger tanks up for sale and then hopefully kind of horse trade from that to smaller 60, 90 barrel kinds of things, which gives us a lot more flexibility. And then the last part of it is for us is that every time we make a large batch of beer, we have to put a chunk of it into the cold box, and then we're holding more inventory on a turn level than on a cash flow basis that you really want to do. So we then become incredibly sunk with the amount of beer we're holding that isn't sellable, for at least another 30, 90 days. I think it's important for the consumers and the people listening out there to kind of be reminded that when you make a batch of beer, you buy ingredients and, you can't convert some of that money back into your pocket for 90 to 120 days. If I make a batch of IPA and I sell it to my distributor and they have net 30, net 45, by the time it gets to them, it might take 90 days for me to put that money back in my bank account. It's a long time.
Yeah. And so making that in 30-barrel chunks and getting paid for that and then making the next 30-barrel chunk 3 weeks from then, making the next 30-barrel chunk can be a better way to manage cash flow through that entire process.
Yeah, we identified that our 3 biggest needs as part of a growing down strategy was occupancy costs, labor costs, and then cost of finished goods, but not, it was more about level of finished goods, not necessarily the cost. Everybody's fighting the cost of the finished goods from barley and input and corrugated and all that stuff, shipping, but it's a matter of how much finished goods do you have on hand? How many days of inventory do you have? And, if you're running lean, you have 15, 20 days. And if you're running fat, you got 100 days. Well, there's a big difference in terms of money in your hand between 20 days and 100 days.
And 100 days of inventory, for a tech company is one thing. 100 days of inventory for a brewery where that product
is perishable.
It's perishable. Yeah. It's a whole nother problem. You just can't run that kind of inventory.
No,
Sure.
and we're lucky on some levels that some of the beers that we make have incredible shelf life. So that's not necessarily the problem. The problem is now found in how much money's sitting in your cold box more than it should be, and what does that look like? And if right now it's $50,000 a month in cash flow, that 50,000 would go a long ways to being able to spool through in different places.
It's money you've spent, and then it's also money that you're spending on footprint, on real estate, and on utilities.
Yeah, energy, utilities,
and all of those things to keep that beer cold until you can sell it. And so it's a triple whammy, in that sense.
It becomes a quadruple whammy when the distributors don't pull it, and now you're destroying it. And it's just one of those things where you have to really sharpen the pencil right now. And it's, even if you sharpen the pencil, you still could have you could have a 10% variance, and even that 10% could be worth a significant amount.
At the same time, we've watched the Lost Abbey open, and we've watched you all open yet another new direct-to-consumer location.
Mm-hmm.
You have the original tap room at the brewery. You've got another location out at Cardiff in the Sea.
Cardiff by the Sea, yeah.
Cardiff by the Sea, and you just opened last year another location closer to central San Diego. How much do you see selling beer directly to consumer via your owned retail and on-premise locations, to be one piece of raising improving the economic picture around, increasing the amount of revenue you make per beer sold?
Yeah. So we've always been a pretty highly distributed beer company. In our heyday, we were probably 85% distributed to 15% on premise back when we only had the tasting room here in San Marcos. And nowadays, our distributed brands are probably 55, 60% of our sales, and our hospitalities come up to about 40%. So on a lot of levels, that seems amazing. But at the same time, the brewery was built to be efficient for distributed things. So the high-speed bottling line, the high-speed kegging line, beer leaving the dock on pallets. You send 1,000 cases of an IPA out. You don't have to build orders and pack it and do things. It's pulling pallets and one guy on a forklift. There's a lot of efficiency in that. Now that we've become a hospitality-facing company on some levels, I mean, there's a possibility that distribution dollars and hospitality dollars could flip in the next year. But that doesn't come with the same margins necessarily, even though you have your own premise margins and you're getting full retail. You have to remember that each one of those comes with a commercial lease, triple net, like we talked about, rising utility costs, rising hospitality, minimum wage. So I used to be very cautious, and I think maybe on some levels we nearly failed ourselves here, and that is that opening additional tasting rooms will not fix your business model. It's just the possibility of cheaper money, because it creates cash flow daily, right? You're now in a situation where I get to open and I can do $1,000 in sales, and that money goes right into my bank account. But it comes with you have higher costs of wages relative to hospitality service. You have higher occupancy costs because you're paying for more buildings and the insurance and all those things. So opening an extra satellite tasting room will not fix business model. In fact, I've seen a number of small breweries look to a secondary tasting room, and it basically put them out of business because it didn't hit their, they didn't meet their projections. So it's not a pure solution.
The additional thing that comes with new locations is on top of all of those expenses is complexity and management.
Yeah.
And that complexity and management also directly impacts your own quality of life and the quality of life of the executive leadership of the business, that are then having to shepherd this additional group of staff and potentially be present and on site, spend more time on the road, be in more places all the time. From an executive leadership standpoint, how do you again, make decisions around some of those things that you are going to undertake versus the things that you're not. I think that's something that a lot of younger brewery owners and operators certainly don't consider as they look at opportunities around this. The overhead in terms of personal time and your own quality of life is pretty significant with some of those.
So the church that you referenced, which was the most recent project we opened a year ago, is the furthest from home. It's 35 miles from the brewery. It is in downtown San Diego. It's a long ways from San Marcos. So reaching that location is not the easiest thing. The other satellite location, Cardiff by the Sea, we have another satellite here in San Marcos. They're 7 to 11 miles away. They're much, much closer, not as bad, and they're just much easier to reach. I think that there's a fallacy, and that is that you can find the people to do it, but you got to remember it's almost like training a sales staff, right? You have these people who are forward facing. They are the face of the ambassadors of the company. You've got to have the right people. Every time you take a great manager and you move them from one location to the next, you have to backfill. There's an enormous amount of emotional capital that goes into that. And then typically when you do this kind of stuff, you're not really adding a lot of back of the house at the brewery level assistance, right? You're just saying, okay, we'll reconcile more paperwork, more cash, more deliveries, more this, more that. So you're bifurcating a lot of duties and a lot of energy, and you're assigning it to another space. Again, with the goal of potentially making more profit, and then that profit can be distributed. But not all operations, these days specifically, not all hospitality operations are highly, highly profitable.
Is there anything that you employ to try to streamline that?
As every business is wont to do, we think that we're great communicators and we're not. We've gone to meetings. We never used to have monthly meetings for the hospitality side, but now with 4 locations, we kind of need that sort of that conjoined, everybody come here, let's talk about it. It's really difficult. Our hospitality program probably is about 20 to 25 employees total now, which is about half of our staff. We don't have a lot of opportunity to bring everybody together. So what we're reliant on is a lot of site visits and stuff, but that's still not the easiest way to build community. So for us, it's really, it's really finding great managers and empowering them with the amount of information that they need, and then hoping that the logistical system that we employ to get the messaging and the delivery, the deliverables and things to them is great. But of course, every business could do better.
Looking at all of the things that are now working against you, are you still happy to be doing what you're doing? And where do you find the joy and reward in this, Tommy?
It's a good one, because it's on a daily basis. There's a lot of frustration, of course, of late. We're still here. I think that's a really big, important part of the message, is that we're still doing what we want to do. I was really lucky to be in Chicago last week for the Festival of Barrel Aged Beer, the 20th anniversary of that. We got to succeed at a competitive level. Our Duck Duck Goose won a gold medal for barrel aged sour beers, then went on to win Best of Show. That's why we do this. That's the win. So that was really bittersweet. Wasn't able to share it with a bunch of my team members and otherwise, because we couldn't fly a bunch of people out. But if you want to remind people of what we do and that we're a world-class brewery, it helps to have those moments. And those moments, as long as they keep coming along because of the work we're putting in, the reward is there. I've been doing this 26 years now, and it's still, I still have a lot of opportunity to take pride in the stuff that we're doing, because it matters. But at the same time, the internal part of running a business is very grinding. And for the last, 16, 18 months, it's been, almost that sense of like we survived COVID and then it got even worse, so it was wild to think that, that wasn't the hardest part of it. So there's still some pretty dark days ahead, I think, with regard to a lot of breweries, including ourselves. But I think we're executing a plan. And I think that that's where we came out in that article and said, growing down is a plan. And if you can grow down successfully, and you can do this, openly, I think it's more important to be open about it than to be closed off.
There are a lot of small breweries who, their experience having launched in the last 5 years or so, they've only participated in the world of craft beer, and they've only operated as businesses in craft beer through a generally up economy. With 26 years under your belt, you've seen ups and downs significantly through the craft beer industry over that kind of time. Craft beer in the 90s was not all up. There was a boom, and then it was a bust, and there was a rebuilding period, and then there was a 2008 recession that completely shredded the economy, and a long recovery from that, which fueled this next boom that started in the early 2010s. From an operational standpoint, as somebody who has gone through these cycles, what do you think are some of the most important things that those operating breweries now should be paying attention to?
That's a heavy one. When I first started this journey, just making beer was enough, and making beer is an amazing thing. There's a lot of breweries, I think, that fall under the same umbrella that I've been under, and that is I've never run a company. This is the first time I'd ever been in charge of a business. Doesn't mean that I hadn't seen what it meant, what it means to operate a business or how to go about that. But that doesn't mean that I'm a great operator. And I don't consider myself to be a great operator necessarily. I consider myself to be a great brewer and someone who understands what they want to accomplish, with flavors. But the harder part of today is that the success of the company is driven by leadership. It's driven by, as you've seen as a magazine editor, point blank that the quality of the beer is not the most important thing. Like, I can tell you straight out, and I don't have to call anybody out for what it is. There's just a lot of bad beer that's succeeding. And that's okay for them, but at some point that won't be okay. And everybody, I think, if there's a takeaway message, I think that everybody learns within their timeline that somewhere in the space of, startup to wherever you're at, that ultimately you have to find your future. And I think you've referenced that earlier in terms of what's next and kind of that stuff. Like, what does our future look like? Our future looks like a company that's not going to rely on growth to be successful. We're going to, I don't want to use the word retrench, but we're going to get back to being small. And then from there, we will strategically take our shots at what amounts to be growth or not. And in that sphere, use our knowledge of the past to be successful in the future.
And that, I think, is a great place to bring this to a close. Many thanks to Tommy for sharing his thoughts as they navigate the challenging waters ahead. AccuBrew is an analytical tool designed to collect and compare the information brewers need to produce consistent results. T&S hop oils from BSG are a revolutionary hop product that gives your beer all the intensity with none of the astringency, and let Clarion Lubricants work with you to create a lubrication program that protects your operations. Of course, holiday time is here. Subscriptions to craft beer and brewing are great gifts for those fellow brewers in your life. And while you're at it, you might as well treat yourself. Go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button, give a gift to someone who matters, whether that's a friend or whether that's yourself, and help us make a difference in the brewing world. We do deeply appreciate your support, especially this time of year. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back Friday with a new episode. Cheers. This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.